Hi everyone, a very good afternoon to all of you who are tuning in or watching this in a delayed telecast. Big thank you for joining all of us in this HeadHunt's brown bag series on the digitalization of work. And myself, advisor to Pioneer Grassroots Organization and also Assistant Secretary General of NTUC, very happy to partner the HeadHunt team as well as the various IHLs who are participating in this series of live webinars for each and every one of you. And today, later on, before I hand over back, to Yeaz, as well as he's sharing shortly on data breaches and managing that in our workplaces and our various organizations. I thought good to use this opportunity to share with everyone a bit on the topic of digitalization of work, and of course, a bit of an outlook of our labor market. Firstly, as you all know, this year we have the impact of COVID-19. And of course, Ministry of Manpower have been sharing through its various channels and through various reports about what's happening in our labor market in the past 9 months or so. Well, it's been challenging times. We do see unemployment going up. We also see retrenchment numbers going up. So overall, I would say it's an uncertain outlook. In fact, in the last 6 months, should I say, the first half of this year, the number of layoffs outstrips the total number of layoffs in 2019. So in general, we are seeing an increased number of people being laid off. At the same time, also unemployment figures have been creeping up. Last week, in fact, when there was an employment report being flashed out by the Ministry of Manpower, we do see various challenges, exacting challenges on various parts of our labor market, and in general, a very soft labor market. And I expect to see for the rest of this year and in the whole of 2020, overall, a very soft labor market in general. Well, moving into 2021, we also see a lot of uncertainties. Yeah, and we are also witnessing a gradual opening up by various countries and economies. And of course, COVID-19 has taken a toll, not just in Singapore, but our neighbors in the region as well as globally. I mean, every country is facing its exacting challenges. So definitely what we are seeing in the past 9 months and moving ahead will be, an acceleration of the entire concept of digitalization. Even prior to COVID-19, we have been embracing digitalization and, the smart nation concept in Singapore. But I think the last 9 months have accelerated everything that has to do with digital. We all know that e-commerce has been a very big thing in the past many months. Many of you, especially during the circuit breaker period, have gone online to do many of your purchases. Even payment transactions have shot up quite a bit. In fact, this week is the Singapore FinTech Festival, and we know the financial technology or the FinTech space is growing very rapidly. In fact, the outlook for this year and next year, particularly in the FinTech space, and with the digital bank licenses announced last Friday evening, we'll be looking at new opportunities in digital space in this particular segment, the financial technology segment. So definitely it's going to be in a way, an uncertain year next year, but also some growth opportunities and some new opportunities lying ahead in 2021. As a word of advice and caution to everyone, I hope all of you out there tuning in, we all know data and digitalization is going to be very big, or has been very big, and will be very big. It's important for each and every one of you to stay ready, relevant, and resilient. Ready the new skills, relevant to the new jobs, and of course, resilient to the new changes. Lots of changes happening. This year has thrown many curveballs, including to myself. Never knew that I had to use so much of the virtual conferencing and virtual meetings and softwares. Like many of you, I'm also learning, and I should say, in a way, with all this remote connecting and of course meetings and conferences, it's also sort of a fatigue to many of you, especially those who are working from home and of course tuning in from your various devices. So do give yourself a break during this year-end period. Cut down the device time, and at the same time also, give yourself a healthy break from many of these various virtual or should I say device engagements. over and above that, I thought useful to also share with everyone about the outlook in 2021. Besides being uncertain, we also see some bright sparks of innovation and new technology, and of course new business opportunities. Yes, this year has, in fact, particularly because of the travel restrictions and restricted air travel, has impacted deeply several sectors. For example, like aviation, aerospace, even travel and tourism. But it has also allowed many companies to pivot, and those who have embraced digitalization have managed to pivot and do better than expected, particularly in some industries. And of course, new opportunities as well. For example, supply chain, logistics, and of course, sustainable farming, for example, and agriculture. So a lot of new opportunities lies ahead. In fact, this year, some sectors have not been severely impacted, are doing relatively okay. For example, in the modern services, financial services, for example, the ICT sector, where a lot of digitalization is taking place. And finally, of course, professional services. So some of these sectors, no sector is spared, but I think some of these sectors are still powering some growth and looking at various opportunities, including traineeship opportunities, many of them for graduating students from our institutes of higher learning. And perhaps some of you who are tuning in may want to search out or look out for some of these opportunities. And on that note, really, I would like to thank the HeadHunt team for partnering with the Pioneer Constituency team. And we are powering here, as you see my backdrop, we are right here in Frontier Community Club, right here in Pioneer Constituency, beaming this live to each and every one of you. And I would like to thank the HeadHunt team, as well as many of the speakers, including today's speaker, Yeaz, who's come all the way from SUTD right here with his team to Pioneer Constituency to share with you shortly on his expertise managing data breaches, and I'm sure you all will benefit greatly. So on that note, a big thank you to everyone, and I will just hand over back to the MC Bell.
Thank you, Patrick, for opening the session. We will now proceed to our session topic, Data Breaches and its Increasing Pervasiveness, presented by Yeaz from SUTD. Before I hand over the time to him, just a couple of housekeeping matters to take note of. Should you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. At the end of this session, we will be conducting a feedback poll, so please stay to the end. Now, without further ado, I will now pass the time over to Yeaz. Yeaz, please.
Thanks for the introduction, Belle. And thanks also to Patrick for talking a bit about digitalization and how the pandemic times that we are living in is moving things. So the topic of the day that I wish to share about will be data breaches and their increasing pervasiveness. And with this, I will also like to thank everyone for joining. I will also to thank our partner, HeadHunt, to organize this very insightful brown bag series where we talk about various aspects of digitalization, such as AI, such as 5G, such as digital marketing. So one of the areas, this is actually one of my area of research, and I wish to share with everyone on this call about data breaches. Okay, so my name is Yeaz Jaddoo. I'm the Associate Program Director in SUTD. So within SUTD, I'm from the ISTD pillar, which is something like the School of Computing in other IHLs, right? And within ISTD, I manage the MSSD program. So what is MSSD? Is our Cybersecurity Masters, and it stands for Master of Science in Security by Design. So academics-wise, I teach within MSSD program itself. So I teach about practical cybersecurity, and I also teach about cybercrime. And research-wise, the two areas that I focus on is mainly intrusion detection using machine learning and deep learning, as well as some of the social aspects and human elements of data breaches, which I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so data breaches, quite a big topic. There's a lot I wanted to cover, but given the limited time that I have, some of the topics that I had to omit, some of the things like, the dark web where a lot of the data that are breached resides. I had to omit that. Some of the other things that I had to omit were things like the legal aspect, whereby I wanted to cover about frameworks and regulations like the GDPR and the PDPA, and how punitive their measures are. I also wanted to talk about training in the workforce to tackle cybersecurity breaches, right? And how effective this training can be as opposed to some of the technical measures I will actually cover in my talk, right? So these are some of the things that I won't be talking about, but this shows you how huge a topic data breaches actually are. So some of the things that I will be covering will be things like, what is a data breach, right? Why does it happen? What are the motivations behind data breaches? What are pushing cyber criminals, attackers, and hackers to carry out these data breaches? How they happen? How do the hackers and attackers do it? I will give you some of the examples closer to us in Singapore, whereby I will cover some of the local breaches. And after that, I will talk about passwords, how passwords is actually one of the main vulnerability and also a human vulnerability which attackers prey on, and how it's used to conduct data breaches for their own benefit, for the hackers' benefit. I will also cover a bit about the defenses that you as a user, you can put up to protect yourself against data breaches. I will also cover about the about the defenses that enterprises and corporations can take up, right? And finally, given in line of the topic of digitalization and the pandemic, I'm also covering a bit about how COVID-19 and the pandemic that we are currently living in has affected data breaches, in the sense that we are seeing a rise in a certain type of data breaches. Okay, so without any further ado, I will go to what is a breach. Okay, so not a day goes by that we hear about security breaches. So security breaches can be things like a DOS attack, so a denial of service attack, where customers to a website are prevented from reaching the website. So we also have ransomware attacks, like the famous one which happened a few years ago, WannaCry, whereby a lot of services were affected. But the topic of the day for today is specifically a data breach. Okay, so what is a data breach? It's a security breach whereby you obtain unauthorized access to confidential data. A lot of the focus is actually on the unlawful methods which cyber criminals use, but there is also the accidental impact, right? So as an example, I have something here which I got from the PDPC website, which talks about Grab not having reasonable security arrangements, not having enough reasonable security arrangements, and accidentally exposing data, right? So this wasn't taken advantage. This wasn't really leaked, but it was an error. So this is also called a data breach. So this is what sometimes people may forget about: accidental data breaches, which happens because of how developers forgot their security principles in implementing softwares and applications, right? But the main topic of the day is, of course, the unlawful ones, whereby you have a cyber criminal. Some people might call it a hacker, some people might call it an attacker, but it all means the same thing. So that person is infiltrating a data source to extract the sensitive information, which is of value for various reasons, which I will cover later in my presentation. Okay. So throughout the whole of my presentation, you will see a lot of visuals as well as a lot of QR codes. So those QR codes, if you're at home right now, you can just scan those QR codes and you will actually be taken to the websites where I have extracted them from. I also have a lot of references, being from an academic background, and I share a lot of the references that I have been using to come up with this presentation as well. So on the top right-hand corner, you can see a very interesting visual, which is tracking data breaches all the way from 2012, right? And the two obvious trends you can see from there are actually the number of breaches, right? You can definitely see that we have more breaches as we are progressing, as we are moving along. not only that, the size of those circles actually represent the number of records which are present in those breaches. So this visual is actually only representing breaches with records more than 30,000, right? And the bigger the circle, as you can see from some of the numerals that are on those circles, we have some in the millions, right? So not only we are having more data breaches, but within each of the data breaches that we are having more records being leaked, more records being stolen, right? So these are the two main trends that you can see from the first visual. The second visual that I have is actually from a very popular website which tracks data breaches. It's called haveibeenpawned.com. Pawn actually comes from a typo on a keyboard. It comes from a gaming background whereby you own someone means you beat someone. So there was a typo given the proximity of O and P on the keyboard. It came up as PWN, and ever since that, anyone who has been defeated, anyone who has been breached in hacker terms is called pawned. So that's why we have this term, have I been pawned, right? So if you go to that website, you will see as of now, I extracted this, I think 2 days ago. So we have around 10 billion records right now on the internet, which has been breached. So these records can have personal data, these records can be passwords, these records can be credit card data, these records can be healthcare data, they can be a lot of types of data which has been breached. But the have I been pawned is very specific. So they only report about breaches which are confirmed by the organization that has been breached. So you have other websites. So I have one below which is called webhost, whereby you see about all the breaches, even those uh, which hasn't been validated by the organizations that have been breached. So you have actually much more than 10 billion records, because have I been pawned is only for those which has been validated, right? And you can see as of on 24th of November, a website which is very popular with Singaporean, Shopback, right, has been breached, and there were 97,000 records which has been breached. Okay, so this is a bit about breaches and their numbers, and what do the numbers represent. If you want to look more around alerts concerning various types of breaches, various types of security breaches, not only data breaches, a good website that I would like to suggest to everyone is something which is called Cyware, which is on the bottom left, right? So you can scan the QR code, you can go to that website, and there you have a news aggregator which aggregates everything from the media and present all the security breaches that has been happening. There's a lot of categorization which happens, and you can actually, it's a centralized place where you can see about all the breaches that are happening. Okay, so I will move on to the next slide now. So I talked about what are breaches. So now I will talk about why it happens. Okay, so the motivations about why those breaches happen. So on the right hand side of your screen, you can see Verizon DBIR. So that's the Data Breach Investigations Report from 2020, which contains breaches which happens in 2019. Okay, so again, there's a QR code for you to view that report. But what can you see from that report? The main motivation along the years, be it from 2015, has always been financial gain, right? So financial gain is one of the main reasons, if not the only significant reason, that hackers are intending to do data breaches. Some of the other motivations and reason might be more familiar to you because of how they are portrayed in movies and in Hollywood. Of course, you have the hackers doing it for fun, or you have the hackers doing it for ideology, right? So, but those, as you can see, they don't really represent the bulk of the data breaches that are happening. So the two main reasons are financial gain and cyber espionage by nation state hackers. Okay. So what about the what about the financial gain? Okay, so I have a study, I have a vignette on the bottom left, which is about a study done by Atlas VPN. You can see how uh, how how much financial gain cyber criminals can actually make from data breaches as well as other security breaches. the revenue in 2019 of 5 of the biggest companies, right? Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, and Microsoft is only around 700 plus billions. But the revenue from cyber criminals is around 1.5 trillion, which is double the amount. So you can see why it's very attractive for cyber criminals to actually carry out all the various security breaches that they are known to carry, right? So a bit of spotlight on the financial gains of cybersecurity breaches. In 2019, so North Korea. So a lot of times people ask, how come countries like North Korea and Iran are so active in hacking, right? So this is one of the main reasons. Because of all the sanctions that various countries as well as the United Nations has put against these countries, they have to find other ways to generate revenue, to fund some of the not so straightforward programs that they have. For example, the weapons program, the nuclear weapons program in North Korea as well as in Iran. So in this spotlight, you can see that in 2019, United Nations, through a Reuters article, claimed that North Korea took 2 billions in cyber attacks to fund its own weapons program. In that spotlight, I have 3 hacker groups which are tied to North Korea. They are nation state hackers. The main ones you might have heard about them is Lazarus. So Lazarus has been doing a lot of operations, and Lazarus has a lot of subgroups, right? If you tabulate all their subgroups, they will be responsible for more than 100 hacks ever since they were formed in 2017. Some of the well-known hacks they are known for would be the Sony Pictures hack in 2014 or the WannaCry ransomware attacks to various individuals and organizations in 2017. You also have a more recent group which is targeting ICS, which are industrial control systems, where you're talking about manufacturing and cyber physical systems, right? So this is a new area where they are trying to generate revenue by gathering intellectual property as well as operations data, which can be seen to be made available for sale on the dark web or on hacker forums in the clear web, right? So another way of generating revenue is another group which is called the dark hotel. So the dark hotel groups actually targets luxury hotel visitors across the world. So it can be in Asia, in Europe, even in US. So these hotel Wi-Fi's have already been compromised, and this group is known to harvest credentials as well as informations about rich customers in these hotels for their own benefit, right? So at the end of the day, you can see that financial gain is the single most important reason why hackers are doing data breaches as well as other types of security breaches. Okay, so I will move on to the next slide now. This is more about how the attack happens, right? So in this slide, I talk a bit about the actions that are carried out as well as the aspects which give rise to those actions being possible to be taken. Okay, so for the actions part, I have something which is called the attack life cycle, right? So on your right side, you can see something which is known as the Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain. In the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, there are 7 stages. It's the earliest attack life cycle. It was developed actually in 2011. Over the years, there has been various other attack life cycles. For example, another one from a US defense corporation, which is MITRE. So the MITRE attack framework has 14 stages. Some of the stages were expanded. And there's also a unified one between MITRE and Lockheed, which has 18 stages. But I think for the purpose of the discussion today, the 7 stages would be more than enough. Okay. Can you help me to minimize? Okay, so the various stages. The first stage is always about reconnaissance, what we normally call recce, right? So within the recce phase, what the hackers will normally be doing, they will be normally harvesting informations like passwords, like emails, like IP addresses, like open ports. Once they find out about all this information, and once they also find out maybe about some of the vulnerabilities in the systems of the victim, they will weaponize. So they will do a custom build of an exploit together with the payload. So the exploit will be exploiting the vulnerability that they have discovered in the first stage, whereas the payload will be giving them the ability to do further damage, as I will explain in a while. Okay, so once they weaponize, so once they use something which they know is vulnerable and they find a weapon that they need to use, they need to deliver it. So most of the times, this is what will happen during a phishing attack, for example, right? So most of us should be very familiar with phishing emails. And you also have other vectors such as USB, which was used in one of the famous attacks on the Iran nuclear program, Stuxnet, right? So after it's delivered, then the exploitation starts, right? So the exploitation can be something as simple as a weak password, as we will see later in an attack which is very well known to people in Singapore. Or it can be something much more complicated, which is based on the software or the web service software that the victim is actually using. So after the exploit happens, then the payload comes into play. And that payload actually helps to download further malware into the system or further scripts into the system, which will give the hacker the privilege escalation capability. So the privilege escalation will help the hacker to escalate himself to something like a root privilege in Unix system or an administrator privilege in a Windows system. And once he is at that privilege, he can actually do anything on the system. And in case of data breaches, that's when the exfiltration will happen. Okay. So on top of the life cycle, like I said, the life cycle focus on the actions that the hacker is actually doing. There is also something which is coming up, which is called the breach workflow. So these are the aspects which is helping the actions being taken, right? So you will see some similarities between the life cycle and the workflow, right? For example, at the center of everything is gain access in the workflow. So this workflow was actually in a paper published in one of the well-known journals, and it's very recent, it's from 2020. Okay, and I've given the reference below as well. So at the center of everything, you have gain access. So gain access is maybe similar to your level 4, to your stage 4 in your cyber kill chain. So before the stage 4, you can see there is drop malware or steal credentials, right? And based on that, there is the social engineering aspect. So this is a bit similar to stage 2, where you have the delivery through social engineering of an actual malware or stolen credentials. Okay. Another way of gaining access can be from past breaches. So what happens normally is just like I have introduced you to haveibeenpawned.com, all these breaches, the data from all these breaches are normally stored in the dark web or sometimes in the clear web as well, and you can have access to them easily, right? So some people will scour the data breaches, the past data breaches, to find maybe software vulnerabilities in their victims, as well as weak credentials. And then they will use this to actually obtain access. Okay, so once you gain access, that's your stage 4. That's when you can actually move to the next stages. So things that you will normally be doing is escalating your privileges, doing lateral movements on the various devices in the network. You will drop maybe additional hardware. You will download scripts into some of the database servers, for example. You will try to crack passwords. You will use password cracker. You will use brute force attackers. That's when you try various types of attacks. Okay. So on top of that, you can see merger. So merger is another aspect that is coming out of light nowadays. So mergers, for example, in the recent attack on Lazada, so we see that the attack was actually possible after the merger between RedMart and Lazada, right? So with the merger, what normally happens, the company which is being merged is actually carrying over its own vulnerabilities, its old vulnerabilities into a new system. And if attackers have attacked the company previously, they can actually do lateral movement into the new merged company to do further damage. Okay. So on top of that, another aspect that you can see is the malicious insider. So this will be someone maybe like Edward Snowden working as an insider and doing data exfiltration. Okay, and below that is something which is very important in the pandemic times that we are actually living in, off-premises data. You can see nowadays, right, with a lot of remote workers, what is actually happening is these workers are having access to data off premises. So they are using a VPN or they're actually carrying the data back home. So this is giving rise to a new set of attacks which is being crafted by hackers, as we will see in some of the subsequent slides. So this is normally how it happens. This is the amount of work a hacker has to put in before he can actually extract the financial gain, which is normally promised with these kind of attacks. Okay. So next, I will talk about examples. Two examples very close to us, Singh Health, right? So Singh Health happened in 2017. And the main mitigating factor, if you actually read the incident report, is after the database server was moved into a cloud. It was actually a private cloud within IHIS, right? Healthcare Information System, which is one of the entities under Singh Health. And that's when normally when you migrate to cloud, that's when you open yourself to a new set of vulnerabilities, and if it's not mitigated, that's what can happen in the end, a data breach. Okay, so what happened after the database server was moved into the healthcare cloud, the H cloud as it is called? So prior to that, prior to August 2017, you can guess that the hacker has done his recce, has done his reconnaissance work. And it was actually in August 2017 that he gained access to one of the system which a user was using by phishing the user, right? And after that, he managed to escalate himself on the system used by the user through a very weak password. And you can see a lot of people actually use weak password. I actually have a slide where I cover about password habits and how attackers craft the attacks based on our password habits. Okay. After he managed to escalate himself to admin on the local machine, he tried to get access to the database server for various months. And there were actually multiple failed attempts, which were discovered by a database admin, but was not really actioned upon, right? So you can see the time from May to June, there was not much action happening. There was not much mitigation and remediation happening from Singh Health, right? Because partly they were not really prepared for this kind of attacks, and also maybe they didn't have the systems which would help them to really understand what was happening. It was very difficult to connect the dots and really understand that this is a nation state hacker that we are dealing with, who is trying to exfiltrate healthcare data, right? So the hacker finally obtained credentials around the 26th of June. And within 1 week, he managed to exfiltrate 1.5 million personal data records, as well as 160K prescription records, right? So the attack was finally detected after a week after the exfiltration started. So on the 4th of July, it was detected and it was immediately contained through firewall rules. Okay, so after investigation done by Symantec, it was actually attributed to a group known as Whitefly, which is also called Mofang. But attribution to certain groups nowadays is not considered really definitive. Why? Because groups love to masquerade themselves. They love to use false flags. They love to use malware developed by other groups to pass for those groups, so that the attacks is actually not attributed to them, but attributed to some other groups, right? So whenever you see any attribution to a group, I would say you should not really take it as definitive. Okay, but what can we see from this slide? So I have two graphs on the right. So the first graph is about detection of a breach over time, and the second graph is about containment or remediation of breaches over time. If you look at 2017, so what used to happen in those days, breaches detection used to take months or more rather than days or less, right? So that's why you see that the breach took very long to discover. There was also not much investment done in securing your systems. And as you can see over the years, 2017 to 2020, attacks are taking lesser time to be detected because, of course, of investments, new technologies, because of sensitization of users, right? So all these, as well as many of the major corporations resorting to managed security service providers to help them with their security needs, right? So all these together is actually helping the industry in detecting breaches faster. And we hope that this trend will actually grow and we detect breaches faster rather than later. Okay. Another attack that I will also like to cover is the Lazada attack, which most of you should have heard last month, right? So the Lazada attack, the breach actually happened in July. So the hacker managed to get access in July and has been extracting and exfiltrating data since July. And as per some basic initial research done, it is attributed to retired assets after the merger between Lazada and Redmart. So some of the Redmart data was on retired assets, which were not properly decommissioned. So this is something that organizations need to also take care of. When you retire assets, you have to decommission them properly so that they don't become data breach liabilities to you, right? So the data was actually discovered on a clear web hacker forum. I will show that in the next slide, right? And firstly, there was the Lazada Redmart Singapore breach, which happened. And after around 3 weeks, there was another one for Lazada Thailand customers, right? So the Lazada Singapore breach had around 1.1 million users, whereas the Lazada Thailand breach had around 13 million users. So you can see some kind of lateral movement here, right? So the attacker first attacked Redmart, then move on to Lazada Singapore, then maybe Lazada Thailand. So you can see that there is an active hacker within their system and who is trying to exfiltrate data. Okay, so now once the breach happens, post-breach, what do hackers normally do? So on the top right, you can actually see the screen from the hacker forum where the Redmart Lazada Singapore data was publicized. So this was done by a data broker. He's not the actual hacker. He's normally known as a data broker. He sells on behalf of the hacker. And the first shot is normally in a private sales. For example, the Redmart data in the private sales was worth around $1,500. After that, of course, it goes to the general public sale where it might be worth only around $50. And after a while, you will see that they will release it for free for everyone in the forum to have a look, right? So I did an extraction of the data, and just below, you can see the data which is extracted, right? So within this data, you can see some very personal information, right? You can see the email, right? So I have covered some of the characters. This is an actual Singapore user. I have covered some of the characters to anonymize the data, but you can see the actual email. You can see the hash of the password, which I have actually used to decrypt, right? And the password will actually decrypted to what you can see. So a combination of quote and 12345, right? You can actually see the name as well as the mobile numbers of the user. You can also see the address of the user. I removed the floor and the unit number, but you can see where the user stays. You can also see 2 credit cards of the user and with only 6 digits, which is covered in the database, right? So one of the card has already expired. It's from 2019 and the other card is actually still active, right? So this is normally what happens after a breach. The data goes on some forum, either in the clear web or in the dark web. And what people will normally do, they will normally use password cracking tools, right? Some of them I have named here. So you have Hashcat, you have Rainbow Crack, and you have John the Ripper. You will normally use these kind of tools to crack the password, and which is then followed by trying to see whether this user actually used the same password in some other websites, right? So this is normally known as credential stuffing or password reuse. We have a tendency as humans not to really memorize a lot of passwords, and we tend to use the same passwords. And you can see by running a simple script, which I ported over from GitHub, which is called cred over, I was able to know that this user actually used the same email and password in Facebook and Twitter, right? So you can see what can normally happen from data breaches and how significant they can be and how aware you need to be of data breaches whenever it happens, right? Okay, so this is where I talk more about passwords, right? On top, you can see a quote from a very respected cyber professional, cybersecurity professional and author, Bruce Nair, right? So only amateurs attack machines, professionals target people. And specifically in this case, I'm going to show how they target the password habits of people. You can see data breaches, right? So the first pointer that I have is actually again from the Verizon DBIR to 2020. 80%, more than 80% of the breaches were attributed to passwords in some kind of way, either hacked passwords, like what I've shown you in the previous slide, or stolen passwords, or even weak passwords, right? We humans, we tend to utilize bad or weak passwords, which are very memorable to us. But you can see that these memorable passwords can be cracked very easily by a computer, right? So there is also the fact that we have an ever increasing amount of websites that we need to access. And there is something known as password fatigue to remember all of them. And that's when we have credential stuffing or password reuse. On the right side here, you can see something which I have labeled as password checkup. This is actually available to users of Google. And this is from Chrome browser, and it's known as the Google Password Manager. So you can do a simple password checkup. This is from one of my friends. You can see that he's using 65 websites. How is he expected to remember password from 65 websites, right? Even though he doesn't have any compromised passwords, you can see that he is using 57 reused passwords. So he's reusing passwords around because there's no way that a human can remember 65 passwords, right? And 31 of those accounts actually has a weak password. So this is a very good tool that a browser, for example, Chrome as well as Firefox has. But normally I don't recommend people to store their passwords on browsers because browsers comes with their own vulnerabilities. Okay. It's good to know what are your vulnerabilities, but it's not good to store passwords in browsers. Okay. So next, I will jump to the standard practice that we have in the industry that password should be minimum of 8 characters. Bear in mind that passwords which are only of 8 characters, they can be brute force very easily. So a brute force attack takes around 3 days. If we are using a parallel setup with maybe 10 GPU VMs from Amazon or Google, if you're using a dictionary word with some combination of numbers of symbols, that can actually take few minutes with a dictionary attack on some of the tools I have mentioned previously. Okay, so in a way, you can see that we humans, we have been trained to use hard to remember passwords, right? So where is the tree? Where is the symbol? These become hard to remember after a while. That are actually very easy for computers to guess. So therein lies the vulnerability of humans to remembering passwords and how passwords actually contribute to most of the data breaches that is happening, right? So the standard that we have nowadays is you need to have a password which is at least 128-bit quality. What do I mean by bit quality? A bit of math, but not too much here, right? So you can see something that I have done on Python, whereby you have your sets of characters. So you have 26. The first 26 is your 26 lowercase alphabets for your password. The next 26 is for your 26 uppercase. The 10 are for the numbers and the 20 are for the symbols. And how do you find the bit quality of a password? You normally take this character space, you exponent it with the length of your password. So if I have an 18 character password, the bit quality is 114. And if I have a 20 character password, right, the bit quality is 127, which is normally closer to what strong password should be, right? So technically, if you look at it, we should have passwords which are 20 characters. It doesn't really matter how we build the complexity of the password, because remember the complexity is the base, whereas the exponent is the one which will increase the key space of your password, right? So instead of nowadays whereby you find websites trying and pushing you to have complex password, they should, in my opinion, focus more on the length, right? So that you have more secure passwords. So for example, for a brute forcing of a 20 character passwords, it will take 6 times 10 to the power of 20 years, which is way, way beyond even the age of the universe. Okay, so a bit of research done about password habits by the CSID, which is a company, I think it's taken over by Experian now. So a bit of research they did, I think around 5 years ago, they found that 61% of people have a tendency to use similar passwords. So, you know, anyone on this call, anyone, any one of your friends actually have this tendency. How many passwords can we remember? I myself can't remember so many passwords. So we tend to reuse passwords, right? So within the people that they interviewed, 60% of them reuse similar passwords. And more than half of them had less than 5 passwords to rotate around the different websites that you have. And I think this is the strategy that a lot of us are actually using. Have maybe around 3 to 4 passwords, rotate them within all the websites. But this is the human weakness that hackers are actually targeting to carry out security breaches such as data breaches. Okay. So I will move on to the next slide now. So this is a study which was done last year. What happens after a breach is announced in the media? So they did a study. They tracked the histories of people. Only 16% of the people visited a breach website. So let's say, for example, how many of you visited Lazada after it was breached? Did you actually go and check? Maybe you are one of them. Yes, I know. Maybe they'll send you an email notification, but did you take the trouble of reading more about it? What was the breach about? Right? So you can see the engagement after a breach happens isn't really there. And this is a very recent study. Only 1/6 of the participants went to find out more. And out of all of those who were affected, only 21, which is around 10%, less than 10% of them, changed their password, not immediately, but within 3 months. And the problem about changing password, when you force people to change password, what really happens is most of the new passwords are weaker or of equal strength, when in reality, they should be stronger passwords, right? So pushing people to change passwords is another issue that we need to look at, right? So for anyone on the call, in the event of any breach, these are the things. This is a summary of the things that you should be doing. You should be reading about the breach. If you haven't yet changed your password immediately if you're affected. And remember, if you're using the same password on for some other accounts, change those as well. And please don't change to a weaker password, change to the stronger password. I have a method later whereby I'll describe how you change to a stronger password with the use of a piece of software. Okay, we humans, we are not trained to change to stronger passwords, so you will need to rely on something else. And if your financial data, like your credit card data, was breached, you have to take the extra steps of going to check your credit information, your bills, etc. Okay. Okay, so how do you define yourself as a user? So this is the slide where I talk about as a user, how you define yourself. So first of all, the piece of software that I was mentioning is a password manager. As I have repeated many times, we are terrible at creating secure passwords. So use a password manager. A password manager will generate a random unique password for every website for you. Yeah, it has its own vulnerabilities, I know, but currently this is the best that we have. And how does the password manager looks like? So on the top right, you will see a screenshot of a password generator in a password manager. You can actually cater it for the length of password as well as the complexity. You can store the password in your password manager, and every time you need to log into a website, right? You can open up the password manager, extract the password. But of course, again, it has its own vulnerabilities whereby you are trying to copy the password from the password manager to the actual website that you're trying to log in. But again, this is on your own computer. It's not somewhere out there. It's not like your hash is somewhere out there in the data breach list for some hacker to actually find out about your password. For a hacker to actually attack your password manager, he needs to attack your own machine, which is something still relatively difficult to do. As most as you can, you have to use two-factor authentication, and Google, Facebook, all the social media websites that you normally use nowadays, they have it, right? I have a link there for you to go and check how you can actually activate them on various websites. And if you haven't done so yet, or if you're not aware of what it is, please sign up for a breach notification website. I have two candidates here, breachreport.com as well as breachaware.com. Okay, so on the right, you can see a snapshot from breachreport.com, which tells you about your own account. Has it been breached, right? It can even let you view your own password, right? So I have below on the top right, below on the right-hand corner, you can see my actual password for something that I used to use long ago, but I have removed some of the characters to anonymize the data, right? So these are some of the defenses that you will need to do as a user. But what about organizations? What about the organizations themselves, right? So what we can see is password vulnerabilities has been known since the late 1970s. So it's 40 years now, right? And what we know is users won't change. So the onus is actually on the developers to build more secure ways of storing password, as well as more secure applications and software. So there are some defenses I talk about here. So password related defenses, first of all, because I covered a lot about passwords. So I think, in my own opinion, we should do away from password expiration because it does more harm than good. It's forcing you to come up with a new password. And as we know, humans are not good at creating new passwords which are stronger than the older passwords. So this is something that I think we should do away with. And at the same time, we should abolish the ineffective composition rules, complexity rules in password. Just go along with increasing a password length. Will give you much more security as compared with password complexity rules. Because if you remember the mathematical formula I introduced earlier, the base is the symbols that you use, whereas the exponent is the length of your character, of your password, right? So working on the exponent will give you a bigger key space and make it more difficult for the hacker to actually guess your password, right? The next proposition is something which is a bit difficult to do, but if possible, you should block users to sign up with breach or common passwords, okay? Something else which a lot of developers has been playing with is passphrase. Instead of using a password, use something which is much more memorable. For example, I have something here about 4 randomly chosen words. It should become relatively easy to memorize after you type it a few times, and it's actually very hard to crack. But again, it comes with the same vulnerability of reuse. So a lot of times, how many passphrases can you remember, right? So all of these are solutions in themselves, but none of them are definite solutions that can really help. But they can make for a better situation of as per what we have right now, right? If you have your data in the clouds, there are some cloud-based defenses, right? So Google has its own service called DLP, Data Loss Prevention, as well as Amazon has its own equivalent, which is called Macy, right? On top of that, you have your normal suite of usual suspects that you need to have in your organization, things like your firewall, your intrusion protection system, intrusion detection system, AV, antivirus, patch management, your security incident managers, right? So these are some of the things that you need to have as a basic to protect yourself against data breaches as an organization. Okay. So next, I talk a bit about some future solutions. So as you can see with data breaches, what happens is all the data are stored in one database. So with something which is called secure multi-party computation, what happens is you have the data spread over multiple databases, and the attacker actually needs to get access to all the databases before he can do an exfiltration. Right, so this is something which is relatively new. It's not still very effective, but I anticipate that in a few years' time, it should become the norm to protect organizations against data breaches, right? There's also something which we call trusted hardware or trusted computing, where instead of the OS or the application dictating access to the data with the use of a cryptographic key within the hardware itself dictates the access to itself, right? So this is something which is again still a bit in the ineffective phase, but it's evolving with time and it should offer a good solution in the future, right? The last one I wanted to cover is the principle of least data retention, which builds on the principle of least privilege, right? So store as little data as you need. You don't have to store everything, right? If you don't need the address, don't store the address, for example, right? Uh, Next, I wanted to cover a bit about COVID, right? So, as you know, the number of attacks you can guess has been rising because of COVID, because hackers are actually exploiting the panic and fear which has been caused by COVID, right? In the beginning, they were using lius which were more catered around health authorities like World Health Organization or the Ministry of Health, right? But over time, based on the fact that I introduced earlier about off-premises data, where remote workers actually using data, accessing data, transferring data within their homes, you can see that the lius have actually shifted to a new set of services. So Office 365, for example, conference services, Zoom, company IT services, courier services, FedEx, DHL, right? Popular streaming platforms, Netflix, Amazon Prime, as well as government agencies offering financial relief. And on the right, I have something which is quite recent. This is the only one I could find out. We should be able to have much more information next year about the rise in COVID, but this is the only one I could find. And it was done by F5 Networks, which is a network device provider. And they did find that the amount of stolen credit cards on the dark web, on the darknet, has actually increased over this year because of all the various phishing attacks as well as the accompanied attacks which happened uh, because of the pandemic. Okay, so this is a bit about COVID. And finally, I wanted to share about the program that I run, right? So MSSD, Master of Science in Security by Design. It's either a 1 year program or a 2 year program, right? So either you do full time or part time. If you do it full time, it's 4 modules over 4 evenings. And if you're doing it part time, it's 2 modules over 2 evenings, right? So in your whole syllabus, you have around 8 modules, and unique to SUTD, actually unique in Singapore, all of them are cybersecurity related, as you can see, based on the list of modules that I have, right? You also have a thesis component. And on top of this unique feature, you have another unique feature whereby you get access to cyber physical system. There's a typo there, it should be cyber, not cipher, right? So I'll correct that before I send the slides. Okay, so some of the cyber physical test beds that we have are about the secure water treatment, the smart grid, as well as the water distribution, which is used by PUB. It's an exact replication, though miniaturized in in one of our research facilities in SUTD, which MSSD students can have access to. The course is actually open for application right now if you want to apply. And the course is only going to start in September of 2021. For Singaporeans, you are eligible for SGD scholarship, which is run by IMDA. I think that opens in January and runs until April. And I have also included some of the cost of the program. And on top, you have a QR code whereby you can scan and go to the application website for the program. With that, I think we have reached the Q&A session of our discussion. So if you have look at the questions. So the first question is, which are the courses are for machine learning and deep learning? Okay, so I think you're talking about machine and deep learning in the MSSD program. So we have a graduate module which is called machine learning, which covers both machine learning and deep learning. Okay, So if you think I haven't answered the question, maybe you can pose a subsequent question to that. Then the next question is, thanks for sharing. Just a curious question. What training does it take to make a hacker? North Korea gives impression as a closed state. How do they train so many hackers? There are a lot of programs out there which can actually train you to have the hacker brain, right? Whether you can actually become a hacker, that's more of a personal decision you have to make, right? So if you want to be, for example, being a black hat hacker, it is not an easy decision to make, but maybe of course you can choose to be a white hat hacker instead. But there's a lot of courses you can take online. Some of the obvious ones, you should start from, maybe very simple things like certified ethical hacker, which introduces you very lightly to the topic of hacking, and maybe after that you can extend your knowledge through some other in-depth courses, maybe within the realm of penetration testing, where they introduce you to the tools that are used by hackers to actually carry out the attacks, right? So there is not one single training you can just go to and become a hacker. It's more of an interest that you need to have, an interest that you need to have in training yourself, in educating yourself, and finding out more, in meeting people, in going for capture the flag challenges. So it's quite a big number of steps, I guess, you have to do before you can actually become a trained hacker. Okay. How are the incident being classified? What are the severity classifications? Okay, so I'm still thinking what you wish to mean. So I don't know if you're only talking about severity. Are you talking about severity of data breaches? I think there's not much information given in the question. Maybe I'd like to skip to the next one. For the examples for Singh Health incident and Lazada data breach incident, what are the incident severity classifications? Classifying incidents, okay, so if you want to classify them, it really depends on the organization own classification aspects, right? So of course, something maybe in the beginning when they detected that there were some failed logins, it would have been a very low severity, for example, right? But over time, once they found out that data was actually exfiltrated, you will see that the severity will have to move. But you will need to have that kind of capabilities to detect what is the hacker actually doing on your system to be able to move the severities dynamically, right? So it's not a straightforward classification, I would say. It's something that you need an expertise, and you also need the visibility about what the hacker is doing before you can come up with such a decision of assigning a severity to an incident. Okay. Is there a part-time course for undergraduate degree? As of now in SUTD, we don't have any part-time undergraduate degree, right? So all our undergraduate degrees are full-time, right? So for example, um, if the only way of doing a part-time degree would be, our graduate programs, which offers part-time solutions. So, yep. What precautions we must bear in mind when using the mobile phone when carrying out online transactions and doing work-related assignments? Yes, so your normal precautions, make sure your mobile phone has the relevant software to protect yourself. So for example, AVs for mobile phones, right? At the same time, make sure that you're using a password manager, right? Don't use well-known passwords, don't use common passwords. It's along the same line about the defenses I have talked about, right? So we have time for how many more questions? Two more questions. Okay, so let me choose. Uh, okay, maybe can you scroll? I can, right? What are the types of attack commonly seen to public or end users, right? So I did cover ransomware, so please beware of that. Ransomware attacks, make sure that you update your softwares regularly. Make sure that from a user perspective, make sure that you are using good passwords, strong passwords. So try to move away from the weak passwords that you have been using. Try to adopt password manager, right? Try not to store your passwords in browsers. It's always the same advice, uh, uh, which stands for any kind of breaches. Okay, so are free password managers like LastPass reliable and safe to use? As I said, they come with their own vulnerabilities, right? So, for example, when I mentioned about copy and pasting, right? So, those passwords are actually available on your clipboard. So, for example, in your machine, if you type Windows button and V, you will actually see your clipboard, which is storing all the copied passwords. So, if a hacker actually has access to that, they will be able to see your passwords, right? So, even though it has its own vulnerabilities, I would say it's the best option that we have. We should not be having weak passwords. I think that's the end of the story. That's what we need to move away from. We need to move away from weak passwords to be able to protect ourselves adequately against all the attacks that hackers are coming up with, right? So yes, if you have not started, please start to use a password manager to generate multiple passwords. Don't do password reuse. Don't reuse the same password. Don't do credential stuffing. Generate as many passwords as you wish using the password generator in the password manager, and have different passwords for different websites. 100 websites, 100 different passwords, everything is stored in the password manager, which has one key which only you know, for you to be able to get in. It's not like your password or your hash password is on the web for anyone to actually crack it. It's in your machine, and it becomes inherently more difficult for a hacker to actually find your own password. And I think in the aspect that I introduced about targeting the user, they wouldn't go through so much effort for just one user. They want to have an attack whereby they can do the most damage, right? So the the possibility that they are going to attack one user, just a normal user, uh, the password manager stored in that user's laptop is very minimal, right? So yep. So my advice that I've given on those slides stands. And if you have any questions, my emails are there. You can drop me an email. I think we have reached the end of the session. I would like to thank HeadHunt again for organizing this brown bag series, which is very helpful for the public to understand about various aspects of technology and digitalization. And we hope SUTD and HeadHunt can partner more in the future to organize much more sessions to help the public. So with that, I would like to say thanks to everyone for joining. Take care, stay safe, and protect yourself. I would like to hand over to Bell now.
Thank you